Alright, sorry guys. Alright, I decided to, I was trying to look on, Amazon for a, wringer. Clothes wringer, for laundry. Um, Need a better way to wring clothes out. I just wrung out a blanket that I was trying to wash. Well, I have 18-gallon totes, and I'm gonna get a couple more of those Wonder Wash washers. We gotta have a way to be able to wash clothes after power grids go down, so. Alright, so this one is out of Lasagna Gardening. I don't know where I left off. Lasagna Gardening and Me. And I do believe I'm going to take this all the way through. Yep, this is going to end chapter 1. Here we go, guys. Alright. Lasagna Gardening and Me. Lasagna Garden book. To get you as excited about lasagna gardening as I am, I want to tell you of the 30 gardens I installed and maintained over a 6-year period. Now that would be amazing, and I'm definitely going to do the lasagna gardening because that's how we're going to put our garden beds together. Why so many gardens? I began building a few to prove my theory that this method was truly a good soil builder and could support all sorts of crops. Then I needed a few display gardens for groups of people who were coming to hear my lectures. It was so easy, the few gardens grew to 30 before I knew it. I never planned to build that many gardens. More than anything, I want you to be able to garden in the way you may not have in a way you may not have thought of. I cannot read. And I want you to be successful in your efforts. Plus, self-sufficiency. Be able to grow healthy food for you and your families. You can learn something from my experience. Just because it is so easy, don't get carried away and get so many gardens going. You can't maintain them. Well, we're going to end up with a lot of gardens, but we're also going to we're still going to create that homesteading community, and I'm going to try to do it through our church. Alright. Besides the maintenance the established plants require, such as pruning and division, lasagna beds need new mulch layers each fall to provide fresh nutrients to the soil and to suppress weed growth. It's one thing to collect materials for a small home garden, but when the number of beds grows to double digits, it can become a full-time job. Well, technically, I'm aiming for Faith First to be my full-time job, so. Alright, I'm cold. Okay. My first lasagna garden. Later in the summer, that I discovered the great yields from later in that summer I discovered the great yields from my mulched but not tilled vegetable garden. I wanted to build a new garden. A grassy lot next to our inn offered a great location with full sun and access to water. The ground was level and we weren't using it for anything at the time. On the downside, the soil was compacted from years of use as a parking area. Overall, there were enough reasons in favor of the site and only that one against it, so I decided to give the garden a try. But this time, I was going to use my new approach. With the aid of my surveyor son-in-law, I laid out a formal square herb garden, divided 4 3-foot square beds with a circle in the middle. In the meantime, I had stockpiled materials to one side of the area, stacks of newspaper, a pile of wood chips for the paths, and contents of my largest composter. Bales of peat moss, bags of chopped leaves, grass clippings, aged manure, some builder's sand, and last but not least, bags of soil amendments bought on sale for a fraction of their spring price. And I'm going to start building up on this stuff, collecting up on this stuff as well. I do need to get a hold of pallets. If I cannot build the garden beds, I will do this like they're talking about, just on the ground. But I will start, adding the mulch layers to the whole area. So, anyway. And yes, I will do videos when we start doing this. Right after Labor Day weekend, I began the new garden by laying down thick pads of wet newspaper on top of the sod. This was covered with a 2-inch layer of peat moss for the gardens and 4 inches of wood chips for the paths. I had achieved the look of a garden instantly by covering the sod in this way. Each day I added another layer to the beds, 4 to 6 inch layers. I cannot read today. Of chopped leaves, grass clippings, compost, manure, other organic materials, and sand, alternated with 2-inch layers of peat moss. By the time Thanksgiving came, the garden lasagna was finished, and the beds were 18 to 24 inches high, and that's exactly what we want. We'd been burning fires in the wood stove for several weeks, and I'd saved the wood ashes. The last thing I did was sprinkle them on top of the gardens, as you would Parmesan cheese on a lasagna. When spring came, I could hardly contain myself as I waited for the ground to thaw. The day I walked out to the garden with my trowel in hand, I was in a high state of anticipation. Beds that had been 18 to 24 inches high had shrunk to about 6 inches, but everything looked good. Using the trowel, I dug down through the 6 inches of black, crumbly soil to the remnants of newspaper, and on down another 3 to 4 inches. The underlying soil, which had been tightly compacted, was now loose. Altogether, I had about 8 inches of super soil to plant in. Earthworms had been hard at work and were still in evidence with each bit of soil turned. There were weeks to wait before it would be warm enough to plant, but I knew the experiment had worked so far better than I had imagined. Back at the weedy, neglected vegetable garden I had walked away from last fall, I began by pulling out dried stalks from last year's harvest. This left me with a weedy, grassy plot. I waded in, stomped down the weeds, and covered the whole thing with wet newspaper. Because it had been tilled for so many years, I simply poked holes in the paper, stuck in plants, and covered all the paper with mulch. I used spoiled hay around the plants and wood chips for paths. Once paths are made, you no longer walk on the growing spaces. As the plants grew, I mulched them with a manure and sawdust mix from my neighbor's barn. Last, I added a layer of peat moss to cover the manure and sawdust layer. The garden was neat and produced well. It was the second year the tiller had sat unused. So I sold it that fall. Lasagna gardening was here to stay. The experiment continues. In the back of my house, across the road from our inn, I installed 4 raised beds. After marking off 4 12 by 14 foot spaces, I laid down overlapping, flattened cardboard boxes on top of the sod and covered them with 6 inches of soil. Next, I covered the soil with 4 inches of peat moss. After wetting the area, I pulled the peat and soil back. Okay, I'm back, you guys. Chloe was making lunch for her and Mandy. Alright, here we go. I don't remember where I left off.
How would you handle that?
I reckon I'd have to shoot.
If somebody stole a piece of candy out of the store, what would you do then?
I'd have to shoot.
Alright, the experiment continues. In the back of my house, across the road from our inn, I installed 4 raised beds. After marking off 4 12 by 14 foot spaces, I laid down overlapping flattened cardboard boxes on top of the sod and covered them with 6 inches of soil. Next, I covered the soil with 4 inches of peat moss. After wetting the area, I pulled the peat and soil back and set plants on the cardboard. After pulling the mix back around the plants, I mulched them with chopped leaves and wood chips. All the plants survived the winter. In spring, I moved the perennials to new homes and used the 4 beds for my vegetable and herb gardens. Next, I began on the front of the house. There was no soil there, and the ground dropped off several feet from one side of the house to the other. I needed lots to fill. The road department was cleaning out ditches and looking for places to dump the contents. I received 4 dump truck loads. All I had to do was spread it. Days of raking hardly made a dent, so one of my neighbors came and pushed it about with a small bulldozer. What would have taken me all summer was done in about an hour. Nothing takes the place of good neighbors. A trip to the dump took care of my need for lots of newspaper in the first layer. Bales of peat moss covered the paper for the first 2 inches. Bags of grass clippings and more peat moss added another 4 inches to the layers. The contents of 2 large compost bins provided another 3 inches, and fall was on its way with lots of leaves. Before fall was over, the front garden was installed. A picket fence divided the space into 2 planting areas. Inside the fence, a gently curving fieldstone path led to the front door before going out a second gate at the other end. Near the house was a combination foundation planting and perennial garden. Low-growing thymes crawled between the stones, and near the fence, assorted perennials formed a bank of color. At one corner of the house, I planted a clump of Korean white birch, then a blue spruce. In late fall, outside the fence, I installed a bulb and perennial garden. In spring, the first blooms came in early March, with a ground cover of yellow crocus. This was followed by early blooming jonquils and hyacinths. Later, bright yellow daffodils and early red tulips came into bloom with a ground cover of blue forget-me-nots. The ever-changing, flashy show of color lasted until it was time to plant annuals. This beautiful garden had gone together so quickly, and, except for the bulldozer work, was relatively easy. During the time I was building the 4 beds in the back of the house and 2 gardens in the front, I had also begun the first of the production gardens. There was to be 8 raised beds on the south side of the house. The first 4 measured 8 by 12 feet. The next 4 measured 4 by 12 feet. 4 foot across by 12 feet. Interesting. And 8 foot across is really wide. I marked off an area for one garden at a time. Next, I laid down thick pads of wet newspaper, then covered the paper with 2 inches of peat moss and 4 to 6 inch layers of organic material, alternated with 2-inch layers of peat moss. By the time I had a garden installed, you could reach down through all of the soil amendments and feel first the warmth of decaying vegetation, then the cool earth near the paper. Underneath it all, considerable worm activity was already taking place. Moving the first garden. When the time came to sell the inn across the road from my house, the new owner wanted to return the area of my first lasagna garden to grass, and I wanted to move my plants in all that great soil. First, I lifted all the plants and, using a very old wheelbarrow with an iron wheel, made the first of hundreds of trips across the road. Once the plants were removed using a flat-bladed, straight-edged perennial spade, I took away all the soil that was above ground level. Last, I raked up the wood chips that had covered the paths. The whole removal process pleased the new owner, and the plants and soil became part of my new gardens. It was necessary to get some gardens installed to house the new plants. I marked off a spot and laid down the thick pads of wet newspaper for the first time. I covered the paper with 2 inches of peat moss, then 6 to 8 inch layers of weeds, grass, hay, and horse manure. On top of each layer of mulch material, I added a 3-inch layer of peat moss and a sprinkle of bone meal. Eventually, the bed was about 24 inches high. This time, I decided to try something different. I covered the bed with a piece of black plastic, held down with bricks around the edges. Every few days, I'd lift part of the plastic to feel the middle of the layers. It was hot, which meant it was really cooking. After about 6 weeks, I removed the plastic, and after removing the heaviest stalks, which had not broken down, found the garden ready to plant. It gave me such pleasure to cook garden lasagna. I did it often after that. Okay. No, I'll read that in a minute. Lasagna gardening, a way of life. The number of lasagna gardens grew at an alarming rate, and I gave impromptu talks as I worked. I was amazed at the number of people who stopped by to see what I was doing and stayed to watch. Some even offered to help. But with this method, creating new gardens was easy, even for a 50-year-old woman using no power tools and no help. And so my life went for the next 6 years. Each year I would finish building more gardens, all with different themes, and bring more and more people to walk the paths and listen to how it had all been done, to learn about a kind of gardening anyone could do with a little effort and just a few changes in attitude. I like to think I helped would-be gardeners get going with lasagna gardening. And that's one of the things I'm hoping to be able to do with this channel and with our videos, is to help people get started in homesteading and gardening and that kind of thing. I won't tell you here about each and every garden I installed over those 6 years, but before we are through with the telling and the reading, you will come to know them. We will connect in the spirit of gardening, and I hope you will make one or more easy garden lasagnas. All right, encourage the worms. Earthworms are indicators of healthy garden soil. If earthworms are scarce in your soil, it can mean that your soil is compacted or low in organic matter, or that it has been treated with pesticides. If you do nothing more than lay down chopped leaves and grass clippings over your existing garden soil, you will see a difference in worm activity in a short time. Of course, full-scale lasagna gardening will greatly help encourage earthworm populations. To increase your worm population even more quickly, buy worms from a mail-order supplier or at a bait and tackle store. Be sure they are common earthworms or night crawlers. Dump them in the garden, under the paper layer or between the mulch layers. They will begin eating, tunneling, and reproducing right away, and they'll quickly go to work on improving your soil. Changing old habits. As a youngster, you may have earned part of your allowance by raking up and bagging the grass clippings left after you or your parents mowed the lawn. In fact, bagging was a common method of getting rid of all kinds of yard waste. The very thought of compost conjured up scenes of untidy, odorous piles of refuse. Changing the habits of a lifetime is asking a lot, but is it? If you are determined to make gardening a part of your life and you are looking for better, more efficient, and healthier ways to accomplish that, you may be open to suggestions for change. Where once we stuffed our kitchen waste into disposals and all garbage into bags, then mindlessly carried them to the curb, we have now been forced to think about garbage. Towns mandated regulations to make us separate plastic, glass, and aluminum for recycling. Some people fought even that small change, though I like to think most were glad to be doing something to be more earth-friendly. Municipalities took charge of recycling hard goods. Now they are quietly forcing change in the way we dispose of yard waste. They started charging for bags to put leaves and grass in, then charging to have the bags taken away. We got hit in the pocketbook, and that got our attention. Suddenly it seemed worthwhile to mow or chip leaves, making them smaller and thus using fewer costly leaf bags. We could justify buying a new mulching mower so the grass clippings could go right back onto the lawn. My point is, we have all made some changes already, and once you have made a commitment to change gardening methods, lasagna gardening is the next logical step. And I do plan on doing our garden beds this way, for sure. So, and that ends chapter 1. So the next one is called Vegetables in the Lasagna Garden. So, and this chapter is going to take a while, and there's going to be different vegetable sections on it. Like, there's getting started, so that's probably going to be the first video. And then the second one is going to be on artichokes, asparagus, beans. Do they go over bush beans, dry beans, French or filet beans, lima beans, pole beans, beets, broccoli, cucumbers, cabbage, carrots, and cauliflower, eggplant, which I can't wait for that one because I want to be able to grow our eggplant. Endive, garlic. That reminds me. I gotta get a garden bed and some garlic bulbs. Kale. Lettuce. Onions, peas, peppers, potatoes, pumpkins, radicchio, and that's really healthy. And I think Baker's Creek has that. I think radishes, rhubarb, shallot, spinach, summer squash, which includes zucchini, Swiss chard, tomatoes, turnips, watermelon, and then that's all of chapter 2. And next one goes into a whole bunch of herbs, so that's chapter 3. There's a lot of videos. I'll probably read several different things, or a couple of different things on some of these. And then berries.
No.
Blackberries, blueberries, red currants, elderberries, gooseberries, raspberries, strawberries, flower gardening, butterfly gardens, edible flower gardens, which I'm definitely going to make sure we have a bunch of those. White garden. Easy care perennial garden. Self-sowing garden. And then it goes into lasagna gardening in fall and winter.
You are now. You ever been through a trial?
Ignoring problems.
Don't steal, man.
Finishing touches.
Water or his wife, and you don't shoot a man in the back. You do any of those things, you get hung. Everybody knows that. Well, remember last year when Franklin...
And then epilogue.
Didn't argue none when we hung him. He didn't have that much.
Now, I'll probably do the resources for this. For lasagna gardeners. So. Hey. Alright, so that is it, guys, for chapter 1. And again, the next one goes into vegetables in the lasagna garden. And I'm going to go ahead and get off from here and get this up there. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye, guys. Remember to check your subscriptions. Always check those subscriptions. Do your research. Hit that notification bell and click on all so you get all the notifications. Now, we'll see you guys in the next video. Bye, guys.